5 of 9, so at 5 of 8:55, so I know where I am. Thank you for being so patient. Although I've given many talks, I have to admit this is the first time I've done a presentation over Zoom. So as you have kindly been very patient, please continue to be patient because I don't know where we're going to go. So here we go. Climate change certainly is a major concern and growing concern within the United States, but across the entire planet. It's certainly impacting the current generation and will continue to impact future generations. And we're seeing some of this already in terms of warming climate, changes in lake levels, impacts on ocean currents, and so forth. Climate change is in part caused by accumulation of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And according to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, carbon dioxide levels are now higher than they have been in 800,000 years. It's about 410 parts per million compared to a high of about 300 parts per million 400,000 years ago. So there's a concern and it's affecting climate. The other aspect in terms of this is that when we talk about looks like a 30% increase, what we also have to understand at the same time is that the amount of carbon dioxide entering into the atmosphere is not inconsequential. Global emissions from human activities was 45 billion tons in 2017. Now, I know for many people, including myself, that it's hard to think of a gas weighing 45 billion tons, but the fact of the matter is that even a gas has a weight, and we're adding a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So, focusing yet another way, carbon sequestration is a process by which CO2 is taken up by trees, grasses, plants in general, and stored as carbon in biomass. And can you see that arrow?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. And it's described by this formula, which I don't want to get too deep into this, but it's a simple one. It simply says that CO2, which is taken up by leaves and so forth, water from roots, and the presence of light, presence of this other chemical called chlorophyll, forms this compound, C6H12O6. This is glucose, all right, or eventually turns into wood, plus another interesting end product called oxygen, which helps us significantly. The point I want to make is this is carbon sequestration. CO2 is taken up and put into tissue. And a noticeable interesting thing here is that notice in this molecule here that there's 6 carbons that are present, and it takes 6 molecules of CO2 to make 1. So not only does it take up through photosynthesis plants, but it actually concentrates that CO2 into 1 molecule. That's the basis of carbon sequestration. Forests certainly are carbon sinks, and by that I mean that they hold carbon, they store carbon. In terms of trees, it's stored as wood, which is semi-permanent. And certainly the atmosphere plays a major role in terms of the cycling of carbon dioxide or carbon in general. Carbon dioxide have the peculiar habit of absorbing infrared radiation. Because they do that, all right, it warms the atmosphere and also creates a carbon dioxide blanket around or in the atmosphere, which prevents the loss of heat to space again. So when we talk about carbon sequestration, we're talking basically about CO2. Carbon absorption ceases when trees are cut down. That whole formula above of photosynthesis ceases. There's no more carbon stored as glucose or wood eventually. This is the key point, when you cut the trees down, it allows greenhouse gases to build up in the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide. The greater the number of trees removed, the greater the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Thus, cutting down large numbers of trees is of concern as it contributes to the warming of the earth. So again, George has already mentioned this, but where does Genesee RiverWatch come into all this? They're a group whose mission is to improve water quality and various other things in terms of the Genesee Rivershed. So where does it tie in? And again, looking at this picture on the right, this is a picture I took 8-9 years ago now, but and it's similar to the one that George showed. In fact, it's the same place just earlier. And the river here is walkable. You can see the log in the middle. You walk across this, but yet it's quite clear that this stream bank here has been eroded away. And why do I say that? Well, look where the corn is up here. This corn on the top right. All right, it's right at the edge. No farmer can plant that way. When this was planted in the springtime, this embankment was further out. How many feet? I don't know. I don't recall. But the point is that during that particular summer, there was a big stream event, hydrometeorological event, where this bank was eroded and this corn was just left hanging there. And you see the same thing on the left. It's just an older situation. But the point I'm trying to make is this soil that here ends up in the river, all right? Impacts of that on the river, certainly there's a loss of real estate, perhaps food production, although that's probably minimal. More importantly, loss of soil elevates suspended solids, which is just soil in the river. It affects the aesthetics of the river. George showed some pictures of the middle basin and lower reaches of the river, and it's quite muddy, all right? And although there's some very popular songs in terms of muddy rivers and so forth, from an aesthetic perspective, most people don't see that as being an interesting place to go. Furthermore, in terms of fish production, if there are any benthic spawners, this sediment will cover up fish eggs and affect fish populations. Another aspect is nitrogen and phosphorus is in soil. When it falls into the water, it can release that nitrogen and phosphorus, which affects the algal growth. In particular, as we get further downriver and as you get into Lake Ontario, the nearshore algal blooms cause beach closings and so forth. Needless to say that navigation is affecting the lower river. There's dredging that occurs periodically, all because of this type of soil erosion, and also at the Mount Morris Dam. So as George has mentioned already, Genesee RiverWatch becomes involved in this type of stuff. It's part of its mission to improve the water quality of the river, to improve aesthetics, and to basically make the environment a little bit better, which is a great goal. It's a goal that I certainly condone in terms of doing it. So how do you stop erosion? George has mentioned rock riprap, and you can see here, this is the same, one of the slides he had, all right? And again, this rock, and there's a lot of work that goes in here. This rock has to be hauled in here. That requires trucks. Sometimes there's trees that are going to be cut down. That requires fuel, sometimes excavators, and certainly has to be brought in to put this in. This all requires diesel or gasoline fuel. That, in fact, is a carbon emission. So knowing that, we do know that this process stops, I should say, stabilizes stream banks, meandering stream banks. It reduces erosion, but it has one little problem in that it doesn't work well in terms of providing habitat for invertebrates and fish. So, and again, if you go, this is the same place just a couple of years later. Here's the stone embankment, and this rock here is great. It serves the purpose of stopping erosion, but it's not great habitat for invertebrates or fish. And one of the goals, of course, of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Genesee RiverWatch is to increase recreational benefits such as fishing. And if you look at this rock does provide little holes and so forth that fish can live in, but it's not great habitat. Same thing with invertebrates. And even if you look in the water with this red arrow, you can see there's hardly any structure. It's structure that improves habitat, increases the viability of populations of invertebrates and so forth. So rock riprap is one, but it takes fuel and which releases carbon dioxide to bring those rocks, to do that excavation. Toewood construction, as George has pointed out already, involves using mature trees. Again, as he mentioned, they are going in perpendicular to the embankment. And it's these root systems that are going to be on the outside into the river. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner, this is not Genesee River, by the way, but you can see how you can't see the trees, but here's all those root systems that all these nooks and crannies and this substrate of tree, wood, and so forth provide opportunities for invertebrates to grow and succeed and to provide fish food, and also as nursery areas for fish. So just as riprap, toewood construction will reduce stream bank erosion. It will stabilize meandering stream bank, and it has the potential to create invertebrate and fish habitat that may in fact increase fish population. The goal of, as I have in the upper right-hand corner here, of toewood construction, one of the goals that's not in riprap is to increase fish populations. But, and here's the big but, it requires a large number of mature trees. In this example here in the upper left, that's about 30 yards and it's about 10 trees. Now, remember what I said before, that carbon sequestration does not happen when trees are dead, all right? Photosynthesis takes place. Also, as with riprap construction, it takes a lot of effort to cut out this embankment. That means excavators, that means fuel, that means carbon emissions. And George showed you this picture. When we now take it to this Chamberlain project, as it's called, and you can see the benches or levees, I call them, all along this half mile, all these trees have been cut down and placed in here, all right? There's a consequence to that. So let's look at this from a different perspective. Us at Genesee RiverWatch became very concerned about the number of trees that were being cut down, being removed. What impact did this have on the atmosphere? Again, as an environmental organization, we believe we're doing good work in terms of improving water quality and recreational aspects in terms of the Genesee River, but are we doing something else that is contributing to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? So we took a slightly different approach. I call it an accounting approach, which is, I think, more people understand a little bit better, but basically it was building a spreadsheet model. And I'm going to give you the numbers first, and then I'll go into how this was done. Based on the Chamberlain project, we did some initial go-arounds to determine just how much carbon was being emitted or not being being affected by the removal of trees. For rock riprap, it was about 20 tons per year. Now, it turns out that 20 tons is for the construction period, which usually just lasts 1 year. Where does that carbon come from? Diesel fuel, gasoline, fuel for excavators, trucks, chainsaws, so forth. But an important point to remember is there's no other carbon release after that first year, once it's built. For toewood construction, all right, which you have now trees, and plus you have some rocks brought in, plus excavating, it's about 40 tons per year. And I'll get into that calculation in a moment. But I want to make the point that even in the first year, toewood construction contributes more to the atmosphere than does the rock riprap construction. Now, in terms of toewood construction, again, there is no uptake again of carbon once the trees are cut down. So there is a real important point to be made here. That 20 tons, this number, which is 19.2, I kind of give you estimates for it's easy to talk about, is that is in the first year. But remember that in the second year, there's another 20 tons of carbon that would not have been taken up because the trees are no longer there. So that's 40 tons. In the third year, there's no trees. That's another 20 tons. That's 60 tons. In the fourth year, it's another 20 tons that not taken up. So it's 80 tons. And in the 5th year, another 20. My point simply being is that we're not removing CO2 from the atmosphere because the trees have been cut down. In other words, we're allowing carbon dioxide to build up in the atmosphere, which is basically the same thing as adding emissions. So tollwood construction provides the opportunity for habitat, increase in habitat, but at the same time, it potentially is adding greenhouse gases, which are responsible for global warming. So this becomes an issue for an organization such as Genesee RiverWatch and probably other groups, at least should be, that how can you do this? How can you mitigate this? Can you get both? We want to do everything we can. Let's look at the calculations first. Get a glass of water here. I'm going to focus on this yellow column, all right? This is just a spreadsheet, and I'm going to come down to this number down here in the lower left. It says 7,600 tons of rock. Our excellent engineers made a calculation that for this particular project, it was going to be around 7,600 tons of rock that we need. You got to move that rock. You got to get it from somewhere. So you go to a quarry, and they were going to use Class 8 trucks, which carries 32 tons per load. It gets about 7 miles per gallon for a Class 8 truck. There's 34 miles per trip, round trip. And for every gallon of diesel fuel, there are 6 pounds of carbon in it, all right? And that's as carbon dioxide. So with those numbers, you can turn around, you come back here in the under Chamberlain in the yellow, and it says that there's 32 tons. It can be carried by the truck, that we have 7,600 tons for the project, 32 into 700 and 7,600. That gives us 238 trips. A lot of trips. 238 times the number of miles, which was 34, gives us 8,000 miles for the project. All right. And again, remember, these are estimates and there are assumptions here that the truck is working at its highest efficiency and so forth. In terms of diesel fuel use, you divide 7 into this and you come up with roughly 1,100 gallons of diesel fuel. And if you convert that into carbon using 6 pounds of carbon per gallon, that's 3.5 tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere, which is surprising, I think, to probably most people, and that you don't see it, you don't feel it usually, but that's a fair amount for one project, and that's just for the rocks, all right, hauling them there. If we go into down to this low one in blue that says excavation, river embankment, and rocks, this is, you had to, as George pointed out, you have to dig that out. The embankment, you may have to level it, you may have to straighten it, you have to reinforce it, but excavator use. And again, our engineers discovered or suggested or estimated that about 7 hours of excavator use. If you use a Deere 24-ton excavator, it's about 8.6 gallons per hour. And in terms of the emissions of carbon, it's the same as before, 6 pounds of carbon per diesel. So if you take that number, 700 hours, the amount of fuel that would be used, multiply it times 8.6 per hour, you get 6,000. You come up with about 18 tons here of carbon dioxide, 18 tons of carbon as carbon emitted to the atmosphere. So you add these two together, the 3.5 and 18.4, and that's how I came up with that 21.9 number. Now that's a fairly large amount, but it's an accounting procedure. All right, now you can go back if you wish. Oops, I clicked something. Let me back up here, folks. You can use a different size truck, you can use less rock, and you get an idea of what you can start modifying in terms of doing the construction. Now, this is the Toewood construction, again, Chamberlain. And again, this is not actually what was done. It was some of the early work done in terms of estimating what the carbon would be. And in terms of carbon emission from trucks, excavation, and actually chainsaw emissions, it's the same type of calculation that I just did. For trees, though, it's something different. And I'm afraid to touch this bar I have in front of me. You can't quite see what I'm looking at. In terms of trees, remember, trees take up carbon. So we need to get an estimate of how much carbon was being taken up by trees. And I should mention, and it's important, that this information, these numbers that I'm kicking out to you, are readily available. They're on the internet. Also, if anybody needs these or would like to see them, I have the references available. They're actually at the end of this talk. It's hard to copy that down, but if you contact us, we'll give them to you. We know that carbon uptake by trees varies according to the age of the tree. For instance, a 60-year-old tree, moderate growth, takes up about 83 pounds per year. An ash tree would be that example. So MH here refers to moderate growth. Fast growth trees would be like a sugar maple, almost twice as much carbon per year. So in our first estimates of what trees were taking up for this particular project based on 320 trees, 320 times 83 gives you 13 tons of carbon that would have been taken up. If it was fast growing trees, it was about 24 tons. The location that this was located, it looked like, based on the literature and the foresters, that it was about half and half, perhaps, of ash and sugar maple. So we came up with an estimate of about 20 tons of carbon being taken up by trees. So that's how we got that number, that accounting. So remember, that's now, if you cut that down, it's not taken up. So we're leaving 20 tons per year in the atmosphere. And over a 5-year period, that's 100 tons. Over a 10-year period, that's 200 tons of CO2. So going back to this thing I showed you before, for this particular project, in the first year, Toewood in the first year would basically result in 40 tons of carbon being left in the atmosphere or put into the atmosphere. For riprap, 20 tons, which gives you the suggestion that perhaps we should be doing riprap, all right? But you got to remember, riprap doesn't provide the potential of increasing fish population, which is another wonderful goal. So again, trees are eliminated forever unless you replant them. So this is dilemma. This is the dilemma to groups such as Genesee RiverWatch, in that how can you fulfill some of the things you want to do? How do you mitigate this? How do you move forward? And this type of spreadsheet or model or accounting procedure allows you to start looking at these things. And I readily admit these are estimates, but they're reasonable estimates. And again, as it turns out, as George said, that we went from 320 trees at the beginning to a little around 100 trees. So you can start cutting back in ways to try to minimize things. Well, again, at the Genesee RiverWatch and the operations group at Genesee RiverWatch, this was discussed, and we came up, and the Genesee RiverWatch came up with a policy, and it's based on something that happened just in the past year. On January 1st, 2020, because of elevated carbon emissions and the global impact on climate, New York passed a new set of regulations called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA. I love the initials. The new mandate basically says this for New York State, that by the year 2030, just 9 years from now, there'll be a 40% reduction in carbon emissions if you're living in New York State. And by 2050, all right, that there'll be net zero emissions. That is to say that there will be no CO2 into the atmosphere, or it has to be somehow offset. And we'll get into that in a moment. So knowing all this, knowing the problems that we recognize, and then the state government got involved in their own way in doing the things that they are appropriately doing, Genesee River came up with the so-called carbon neutral policy. And I'm going to read some of this because it's easier. And this is their wording. As a leading environmental organization in Western New York, Genesee RiverWatch supports the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2020 and will take tangible steps to help realize the Act's carbon reduction goals. Genesee River will seek a minimum carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality means that there's no net gain in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And each of its construction projects that it initiates and implements, whether by themselves or in partnership. Three key aspects of it, guiding aspects perhaps: minimize the removal of carbon sequestering mature live trees used in the project. That is, using an accounting procedures like I just talked about, we can determine or reduce the number of trees used if we're going to go with tow-wood construction. Minimize the release of carbon dioxide during the construction process. Let me grab a sip of water. And by that, it means the burning of fuels. Now, at first, I think when we started working with this, I don't think that was very much on the table as a recognizable thing that could be done. But I was just listening to March Madness the other day, and General Motors is advertising a Hummer with 850 horsepower that's electric, which suggests to me anyways that the timing's coming where perhaps some of these heavy trucks and so forth are going to be using battery power, not fuel, fossil fuels as a way of moving stuff, which means that potentially can be reduced. Third aspect of this is, and I think this is really important, undertake specific and verifiable carbon offset activities, which will result in zero net addition of carbon to the atmosphere over a period of time. And we chose 10 years. In other words, if we are emitting CO2 that's above neutrality, we're going to do something that reduces that, all right? Excuse me. And they have some guidelines, and I'll just kind of mention these. This policy will apply to all construction projects within the Genesee main stem and tributaries. The policy will apply to all construction methods employed: riprap, tow-wood, and any other new methods that come up. 3, since trees are a terrestrial vegetation able to absorb carbon, in other words, carbon sequestration, and have the greatest potential for keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere long term, that is, they store it semi-permanently as wood, Genesee RiverWatch will strive to plant trees to offset carbon sequestration losses and carbon releases during construction. Again, what they're simply saying here is that they're going to, if they exceed their neutrality in terms of carbon emissions, they're going to do something about it, and they're going to try to use trees. Offset activities moving down will be immediately adjacent to the Genesee River watershed. Offset activities must be verifiable and permanent and represent new additional sequestration of carbon that would not otherwise have been occurring. And what I'm trying to say, or what it's trying to say here, is that you can't go down the road 5 miles and rent or buy 5 acres of land that have trees on it. That's not taking up more carbon. It's just setting aside trees. It's not helping in terms of reducing the carbon load. 6, this is something that the state requires these days, and inappropriately so, that any offset activities cannot harm disadvantaged communities. 7, all these activities will be based on a model of each project. Will be reviewed and agreed upon by Genesee Watch people. By that is that this is to be thought of ahead of time. In other words, there needs to be a plan. Mostly designs and plans are made for pre-construction and construction and post-construction activities such as this are not generally added unless somebody talks about them. And again, finally, last thing I'll mention, which leads right into this, during the planning stage, Genesee RiverWatch will ensure that post-construction offset activities are agreed upon by all, included in appropriate contracts, because we do work with contractors wherever possible, and more importantly, adequately funded to ensure that tree planting, if it's used, is initiated and completed, and there's survivability. So in conclusion, here, Genesee RiverWatch's mission is to improve the water quality of the Genesee River and its tributaries and to create environmental, recreational, educational, and economic opportunities for its communities. Activities such as stabilizing stream banks that contribute to improving water quality and hopefully increase recreational opportunities and fish population. These are all good goals. They all help society. They help the local community and helps people discover Genesee River in itself. However, we must note that such projects contribute to the production of greenhouse gases, that is CO2, for example. There's also other greenhouse gases. In view of the New York State mandate to reduce emissions and achieve carbon neutrality in our daily activities, we need to consider a more sophisticated accounting of where we are generating and augmenting the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through mitigation efforts such as tree planting. Finally, and I think this is an important point, the argument that each activity is so small that it does not impact the environment is at best a fallacious argument. It is the cumulative effect of many emissions, often small, that are impacting climate change. For those that work in the water world, we had the same issue 30 years ago in terms of phosphorus. Everybody said, oh, it's a small impact because it's only one little location, but it's the total load of phosphorus or the total load of carbon into the atmosphere that's important. How do you mitigate that? Tree planting is one approach, and where to get them becomes an issue. Where do you get enough trees? How do you plant them? Do you have enough space, and so forth? And again, this is the picture that George showed earlier of some of the folks planting trees. So that ends mine, and as I understand this, we'll take questions at the end, and in view of my inability to run Zoom, I will cease for now. With this, I'm going to introduce, I have the fortunate honor to invite, excuse me, to invite Dr. Michael Bowler, PhD. He's a member of the Genesee RiverWatch board. He's an associate professor at St. John's Fisher College in the Department of Biology. He's going to just discuss crowdsourcing as a means to satisfy the demand for trees for stream bank restoration projects, something that I just finished up on. So without further ado, Michael, I need to do something. I need to get out of stop share.
Yep. Yeah.
Voila.
And can everyone see my screen now?
Yep.
Well, excellent. You know what? I just want to say that I really appreciate Joe's leadership in this carbon conversation. You know, we were talking about this great new, process, this towwood construction, and Joe's like,
remembered I had a thing.
Wait a second.
We
need to think about this. George, if you go into the partner or participants list, you can mute people right there. You can just click a button and mute them. You can see who's muted and not muted on that list. Anyway, and I think I'm actually excited because in the fall, one of my classes in sustainability program is going to be partnering with RiverWatch to work on that carbon model and thinking about those costs and trying to help develop a more comprehensive model and understand how we can address these things. And I'll save, I've got lots of thoughts there. So yeah, we're going to talk about this project, which is literally so new. I believe that we came up with this maybe in January. This is something that like a spark that got ignited in our brains, and we've been working on getting it going. We don't have a ton of time left today, so I will be concise as a professor can possibly be. But it's really a project between RiverWatch, me and some other professors at Fisher, the Oatka Creek Watershed Committee, and a new organization called Rochester Ecology Partners. It's really just trying to think about how we can use this idea of crowdsourcing to help address a couple of different questions. Let's see here. So you are probably familiar with crowdsourcing, even if you've never really thought about this term. Crowdfunding is a kind of crowdsourcing, right? You maybe have heard of more, but we're really kind of thinking about more of a crowdsourcing of not just money, right, but of crowdsourcing materials, a model where goods and services are obtained through the collective effort of a large, possibly loosely connected group of people, is the definition I came up with. It's something that has been actually around for a while. It just hasn't been called that. I think it was the term crowdsourcing was kind of invented in maybe 2005 or something like that. Maybe it was even 2015. I can't remember. I was doing a little bit of research because I'm certainly not an expert on this. But in my research, I was realizing, yes, so the Audubon Society's Christmas bird count was a crowdsourcing project, right? Someone had the idea that, we wanted to understand what's going on with birds and pollution and understand their numbers. And everybody can participate and collect data. So this idea of citizen science was kind of born there. That is, really just getting as many people as possible to contribute to that data set. And that's a really, it's been a really powerful thing for us to understand that over the last century. I discovered that Mr. Peanut was actually crowdsourced before crowdsourcing existed. It was a contest, like a mascot contest that in 1916 they put out a call for people, and so I think a middle school student actually came up with the Mr. Peanut logo, which apparently they killed off or something a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly the details. The SETI at Home projects, where this is this search for extraterrestrial life, uses people's computers. You install a program, it'll use the background efforts of your computers to really get out into the crowd, the effort of crunching numbers in the data from observatories from around the world, such that we can try to find out who or whether or not we see signals. Wikipedia is this one right here, is an example of that. We have contributors adding their ideas and doing the hard work of trying to figure out how to define things. And I'll credit Wikipedia actually with this nice collection, most of this nice collection. Even things like Waze. I don't know if you guys use Waze as your mapping app. So Waze collects traffic data from people's phones who participate or use that app to help predict traffic, as you're, getting from one place to another. People actually contribute pothole warnings and, traffic and all sorts of different things, right? So lots of really cool examples. Even like this year, right? We've got the pandemic happened, and guys, I'm sure everyone will remember back in the spring when they realized that it was, imperative that we wear masks to protect ourselves and each other. A whole crop of people started, producing and donating masks, face masks that they were creating in their home, with their sewing machines. And that's actually getting much closer to what we're thinking about as far as a crowdsourcing effort. And then, of course, the Cornell Cooperative Extension around here does blooms or blocks in blooms. And actually, I'm not super familiar with this. I may not characterize it properly, but this is a program where you can donate your clippings of your plants, things that you've propagated, house plants, garden plants, all these sorts of things that will be donated to the Cooperative Extension, and then it's going to be sourced back out to people as a fundraiser and to help get people plant materials. Right? That's really similar to what we think we've got that we want to get going on here, because as you've heard, with both the need for specific projects for stabilization and the need for our sequestration, for our carbon policy that we've created, we're really talking about needing a lot of trees. And it wasn't really mentioned in the other presentations, but I've heard from George that getting these trees it's possible, right? But we're not getting them from local sources. We're having to actually go to nurseries all the way as far as Ohio, I believe, in order to source that number of trees. We have one state-run nursery, I believe, is it Saratoga, that supplies a bunch of trees for different programs that are around. But the demand that we see for our projects alone can exceed the supply that we have locally. And so we're thinking, what are the ways that we can help address that demand while also doing some other things. Actually, we've defined a few questions here, right? How do we get lots of trees? Lots of trees, we're talking thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of trees, right? Potentially way more than that. But then also, like, how do we engage the public with the watershed in meaningful ways? I've worked, with the education committee with RiverWatch and with my work at Fisher in how to get school kids involved through through the meaningful watershed educational experiences in a grant that we've got with NOAA, how to engage through the aquatic education network to get teachers involved. So this could be a way, just saying that that's a real driving force in what we're doing here at RiverWatch is important to remember. And then the third question is, can technology and this crowdsourcing idea help create a process to do both of these things? So I'm going to, walk through quickly, what our ideas are. That I will again caveat that these are super fresh ideas that we are working on, fleshing out, and hopefully get a little bit of feedback on how we can make this work. So if we want to build a community of tree growers and I guess tree donators in this crowdsourcing model, we're thinking there's different ways that we can do this. We could certainly engage with classrooms. We understand that, we're trying to achieve all sorts of science goals in our K-12 education, how life works, how, systems work, all these things are really important there. So certainly, getting classrooms to sprout seedlings from seeds that we might be able to provide them can at different ages could certainly supply a bunch of materials that we could use as a feeder into our bigger program. We could also even think about so we're sprouting things and getting seedlings growing. Can we then use those seedlings as a source of maybe the bare root seedlings that we're using for projects, or to feed other programs? So we're not talking about necessarily schools creating greenhouses full of seedlings. However, that is a possibility for a bunch of schools around town. They have greenhouses, and I've heard that they're often looking for things to do in those greenhouses. Maybe growing young trees is going to be a really powerful way to do that. But then also think about how we might have either give out bare root seedlings or smaller trees that they might be able to grow those trees to a desired size over the course of years. One of the things that we recognize is that the survival rate of young trees, of bare root seedlings, of things that are not protected is really quite low, considering all the grazing pressure from deer and different animals. The bigger the trees that we can plant, the better their survival rate is going to be. The more trees are going to be on those projects, the more carbon sequestration, et cetera. So if we can get trees a head start by having them be, grown under protected conditions, and nurtured and babied really for quite a few years, that will really benefit these projects quite a bit. We're looking for not, tiny little, we really don't want 2-foot seedlings, which are only a couple years old. We want, 6-foot trees that have a good diameter, such that they're much more likely to survive that grazing. In fact, actually, you just need them to be taller than the deer can reach. That's the ideal, right? And then they'll have a really good chance. Of course, if we talk about putting together all these or getting together all of these seedlings, I could imagine a situation where a bunch of kids in classrooms, they're going to want to grow a bunch of trees, probably more than any of those individuals might be able to handle, and their families and whatnot. Certainly be a source for materials that we could then spread out into other programs. And of course, using classrooms, we can recruit families into a process, maybe where they're actually nurturing trees at home, that I'll get to in a second. We'll also be connecting students to the watershed through these stewardship projects, right? So this is where it leads into this meaningful watershed educational experience. We can imagine if you're a student in a school that's adopted this program, and maybe in second grade, you planted some trees, or you took some seeds and you grew some trees, right? In third grade, you maybe learned a little bit more about ecology and how things are all connected. In fourth grade, you've learned more about the watershed and how water is important and how stream bank stabilization works, right? And all along, you've been helping to nurture a little nursery of trees, even if it's not a lot. And then occasionally, we're going to come by and we're going to collect that older tree, that 5-year-old tree, and take it and use it in a stream bank project. Maybe your meaningful watershed experience then eventually is to go out, do some water sampling at a place where we've done either some demonstration projects of what stream bank stabilization is, someplace closer, or potentially even out to one of our bigger projects. And we can connect a student with, these are the trees that students like you grew, if not you, your school, itself grew, and is now connected to the watershed and helping provide the stabilization that's going to keep our river clean. And that would just be a really meaningful, I think, an awesome way for us to connect students and understand that the little impacts that they have and what they've been doing is going to, have a bigger impact if we do enough of this collective work. And then, of course, thinking about this crowdsourcing, we might also think about individuals, right? What are the ways that we can engage individuals into this system such that we can achieve this goal of getting bigger, more mature trees that can be better utilized in these projects? So we imagine different ways. Individuals might be able to adopt trees on private property to grow them to a desired size over 3 to 5 years. When we've had these meetings, I say, I'm really exceptional at growing maple trees where I don't want them. And then not noticing them to the point where they're big enough that my kids name them, at which point I'm not allowed to dig them out, right? I have to actually I have to replant them someplace else because my kids become attached to these things and I'm a softie. So I could totally see a way where I could even donate those trees that I don't want anymore, or grow them up on my property. I've got a half acre, it's not huge, but I could certainly contribute and me and a whole bunch of hundreds of thousands of other people are doing that, then it could be quite a few trees. Additional, and actually that could be, oh, sorry. I'm a little out of order here. I lost my one picture. Okay, that's all right. That could be growing trees in bags. We talked about how do we do this in a sustainable way? Maybe this is taking old retired grocery bags, like burlap sacks and things like that we don't want, and having those be partially buried in the ground so that we can help those trees grow, but then maybe collect them more easily. There's certainly techniques to shear the roots off around the tree such that you can get the tree to develop a tighter root wad so that they can be transplanted more easily. These are all some things that we need to figure out. The other one is to maybe have homeowners and landowners both plant and grow willow shrubs that can provide us the material for the live stakes that George mentioned earlier. These live stakes are basically, you can see the bundle there on the bottom. It's going to be, stems of willows that are properly prepared and properly stored that we can then use to really, that's the really quick way of trying to get a lot of material growing. So you can imagine if you're a homeowner that's got a part of your property that you don't mind having some willow shrubs, that could be a great source, and then get you trained up that every year or whenever we have a call for stakes, you and other volunteers might be able to come through and harvest a bunch of those stakes so that we can have our own supply, and we can store them throughout in refrigeration, store them for long periods of time and have them ready for use whenever you need to. Of course, this is something that the timing of this is important. You don't go cut live stakes at any moment. You have to make sure that you've done it when the trees are at the appropriate level, place in their annual cycle. So what we've done so far is, we have applied for some funding for this, but we've kind of defined our process so far to figure out how to get there. We haven't actually found any models that are doing this crowdsourcing program the way that we're envisioning it, right? That we're getting people involved to be part of this community to start producing materials to give right back to us at some point in the future. Certainly the gardening program that the cooperative extension runs is something similar, but those are coming from materials that people have that are growing, that they're donating their excess. We're really talking about maybe a two-way thing where we're getting getting trees out to people such that we'll get them back eventually. So working with Ron Sicker, who's a professor here at St. John Fisher College in the marketing program, who really is an expert in this idea of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, we're going to work with them to devise a marketing strategy and drive interest and determine like technical details for a platform by which we can utilize the technology. We haven't actually gotten really all that very far in this, other than our initial conversations and trying to talk about timing for this. But I'm really excited to try to understand better is, how do we utilize that, that business marketing part of this to drive participation. Additionally, while we're defining this crowdsourcing program, we need to think about, what it is that we're actually, like the plant materials, what are the techniques that we're going to need to share with people for growing those live stakes for saplings and seedlings. We need to figure out what these future processes for collecting and transporting of trees. How are we going to actually manage this? Because it's certainly going to be different than us ordering up trees in, getting, a truckload of trees coming in. Like we're talking about figuring out the ways that we're going to be able to work together as a community to make a lot of those things happen. So we're the plant team, which is, including people from RiverWatch and the Oatka Creek Watershed Committee and a bunch and some technical experts is putting that together. And then additionally, thinking about how do we get those classrooms involved, because while we think that it's probably a pretty important part of this to really hook the kids in young and help them understand how they can contribute. So figuring out what those classroom support structures might be. We actually are doing a pilot program with the Genesee Community Charter School. They actually run this amazing program where every other year they traverse the length of the Genesee River with their, I think it's their 5th graders. And so this year, in preparation for doing that next year, they're learning about stream bank stabilization. We're talking about getting them some live stakes that they can start to grow to help them understand, what it is, what are the roots doing to stabilize the bank. We're gonna get them some small trees and some bare root seedlings and try to see if we can just do a pilot demonstration of how we can get a classroom to be involved with those parts of it. And then additionally, I've got students in the sustainability program that are going to be working to develop the ecosystem services and carbon benefits parts of this. So really understand, put some numbers, some rough numbers still, because we're gonna save the big carbon project for the fall, on what it is that this program can do and connect with people to the ecology. And then looking to the future, right? We're going to need to create this crowdsourcing platform. So I don't know what that is yet. This is just a screenshot of GoFundMe. I doubt we're creating our own GoFundMe, but hopefully we'll be able to find some place that will allow us to do this, because we're really thinking that part of this is making this community of people. I would imagine, like knowing my kids and knowing the Boy Scouts and different people, they're gonna, I think, be connected. If they're growing trees, they're gonna want to share that. And we don't know if what does that mean, sharing out that information. Are we posting pictures of our trees as they grow? Are we seeking out advice from people if we see a problem? What is that? That's what we're going to try to figure out, is to understand what that platform is going to be, how loosely or how formal it needs to exist to make this project work. So we're going to be working with, well, that's part of that definition that Ron Sicker is going to be helping us with. And then, of course, we want to launch a demonstration project eventually. So once we get these things figured out, the idea is that we will probably do a soft launch, right? We'll seek out partners that we know and people that maybe are already connected with Genesee RiverWatch that are going to be patient with us as we figure things out and make sure that this is going to work. And hopefully learn some lessons on how we can actually make this program work effectively. And then, we'll hopefully be able to allocate some of those crowdsourced trees to some of these projects, whether or not it's one of our upcoming big projects, or even if it's, doing some of the smaller projects like we have on Oatka Creek and other places, to really kind of close that loop. And then, with that, we're hoping that we'll be able to have a program that we can launch to a wider audience. You imagine, we've got a lot of people live in the area. We have, we wouldn't need a lot. We'd only need a small little sliver of participants to really maybe make a big impact on the number of trees that can be produced, given the amount of people out there that are interested in environmental causes. I really do see that this could potentially be a model too that could be shared, with other organizations in the future to really help them understand how they might be able to do the same kind of sourcing. Well, that's an extra slide that got inserted there somehow. So just to circle back to these questions, how do we get a lot of trees? So our idea is that we could get a lot of people to help us grow these trees, right? How do we engage public in the watershed? I think every time that we have someone who's growing a tree, and they're gonna, have a little bit more ownership of their, part in this the stewardship story with our Genesee River, and I think that it could be a really good way for us to engage the public. And then, this technology question, can we create a process that that does this? Well, we think so, and we're hoping to figure that out really soon, demonstrate that we have the ability to engage people in a different way to help us produce, these ever important sources of what you've seen today. Really important for carbon sequestration, for stream bank stabilization, for understanding how we can support our biosphere. And with that, I will wrap it up, and it gives us some time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. And thank you, Joe. Very, very well done. I told the story really well. I mean, as I'm sitting here listening to it, thinking I understood it ahead of time, I certainly understand it better now. So it looks great. I'd like to open it up to questions. All you need to do is let me know in the chat, or we can just do it. I don't know if you can raise a hand. Can we do that, Michael?
You can. It's not always obvious, though.
Yeah.
I'll actually start off. One of the things, just to follow up on Joe's presentation, which I think is really great. There was a comment in the chat too. Too bad that we can't. There's no shortage of dead ash trees, right? In place of river. Too bad we can't float them down. And that's a really good point in that it's about the sourcing of trees. And we've actually talked about this a little bit too. Like, what if there was a way for us, if we can source trees that aren't taking them out of the system, right? Maybe they're already dead, or they have a fate that's been determined that we can't influence, right? And if there was a way for us to stockpile tow wood, construction materials, tree root wads, such that they can be used for these projects, I think we could like do a lot of source reduction in that initial carbon impact. But then also it means that we're not losing that annual production because it's already gone. You've got to be careful not to encourage people to rip out their trees simply because they know that it has a better outcome. But I don't really see that happening. So I think, as we develop these processes, we'll maybe be able to do that. Yes, and then with the woolly adelgid, the hemlocks are dying as well.
Mike, this is Joe McCarroll. It's every once in a while I lose you in terms of the audio on this, and you may have said this, but one of the problems with ash trees that are dead is that it's the root system that you want, and usually that's what rots out. So you can't really do what tow-wood construction is meant to do in terms of creating habitat with those root systems. So you'd
have to get them really fresh, wouldn't you?
That's right. Yeah.
So going off in the woods with standing deadwood is not an option, because you'll just destroy that as you try to pull it out of the ground.
Yeah, I jump in. This is Maureen Leupold from Oatka Creek Watershed Committee.
Sure, Maureen.
I just had a light bulb go off in my head as we were talking. If I go back to when I mapped wetlands in Genesee County many, many years ago, like midsummer, you'd go to a hardwood swamp that the water has receded for the summer, basically. And the forest floor would be absolutely full of redwood or red maple seedlings, maybe at the 2-leaf stage. And I know, my husband's the tree planter in the family. And he has done this many, many times, just gone in at that stage. And even though they're leafed out, they're small enough that you can capture them and put them in a pot. And that, if we do that, and there's so many conservancy areas that I'm sure we could go in and they'd be happy, because these trees are not going to survive once the water comes back, and they're here already. All we got to do is go get them. And there's probably, red maples stick in my mind, but there's probably swamp white oak and who knows what else, if we're really scoping them out.
Yep.
That could be a huge source, free.
Good idea, Maureen. Thank you.
I think schools too, like, for example, my kids have already gotten, this is an oak tree that's been growing in the classroom from just acorns that the kids collected. This is just cuttings thrown in a jar, and there's several ones that have started roots. It's very easy to do. And there's a new project that I've learned about, which is called winter sowing, and you throw these into old plastic bottles and milk jugs, and you can put them outside, and you can actually grow, they'll actually grow a number of things. So there's a lot of cheaper ways that you can get a lot of material.
Could you explain again what you did with that bottle again, please?
Sure, it's called winter sowing. And basically you take an old bottle or a milk jug and you fill it halfway with soil. You cut off the top, put your seeds in, and then you use duct tape. I didn't even put it all the way around. Most people put it all the way around. And then you can put this right outside. This happens to be switchgrass right now, which is why it's grassy looking. But I could conceive you doing it with trees or perennials or whatever. And the materials are cheap. You can recycle pretty much anything. I've used tiny little mini water bottles. They work. I've used these 2 liters. I've used milk jugs that are not clear. They work. So even white milk jugs work. So I've had my kids bring in what they've got and we just fill it with dirt. The biggest expense is the dirt. So you get a source of dirt and you can just put them outside. The kids can have them right at their house. So it's a super easy way. You water it maybe, couple times a week. You put some holes, you got to have some drainage holes in the bottom, but it's very simple, cheap construction.
Yeah.
And you can
Very cool.
You can take the kids and go collect things. I also have another way of growing pines. You just take a pine cone and stick it on top of dirt in a container. It takes forever and it's not a very great, I haven't gotten the germination rate up yet, but I've got some baby pine growing too from that. So you can have kids go out and collect stuff from their backyards and bring them in or plant it themselves, or you could just direct plant them. If you don't have time to do all the growing, the kids could collect things and then go plant them out into your watershed area and hope for the best.
Yeah.
So there's a number of ways you could do it.
Very good. Nice idea.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as an example of a stewardship project that can connect kids, so Kim is one of our teachers that's participating in our BWET program. And so all the teachers need to have a stewardship project. And so, this year we've all had a challenge of like, well, how do you get kids out to the watershed to have this meaningful experience and to do these stewardship projects when we're not allowed to do field trips? So doing stuff like this, you can make that connection, right in the classroom, and I love it. And so we've been thinking about how this could be a really a good plug and play kind of project for classrooms to get involved with the watershed. Excited about that.
Cool. Very good. Any other questions? Just jump in if you have one.
I saw a question come over I think the chat line about, I think it might have been from Lee, that why not use rock riprap and toewood construction at the same time, use a mix of the two. Maybe you want to talk to that, George, or I can too.
Yeah, well, they both are going at a toe of the bank, doing the same thing. So that I don't know how you could mix them, but that's something we could talk about. I haven't really thought about that. Up till now, it's either been either or. I'm not sure how they would mix together.
One of the pictures that I showed actually had that, in that there was a mix of rock riprap and toewood, and I could see how you could space that, 20 yards of toewood, 20 yards of rip, and then so on, and that reduces the number of trees, but also creates some habitat. Usually construction firms don't like doing things like that because it requires 2 approaches and different things are done and costs more. But I don't see why that's like something like that wouldn't work.
Yeah, and if we're talking about making sure we're going the extra mile to make sure that we're thinking about carbon, like it's gonna cost more, right? So, we just need to incorporate that into the model and understand what those costs are, because in the long term, maybe it costs less because we've actually not externalized our costs. We're internalizing things.
Hey, we have actually used that combination method in a sense, both at Edelweiss and at Chamberlain. Either end of the Edelweiss project is tollwood.
George, that was me, Charlie,
Yep.
that asked that question. Hey, I
Oh,
was wondering, there's a lot of farmers down, all over the place, and people that own quite a bit of land. I wonder if we can just try to, get a few folks to like sort of donate, I guess, in quotes, an acre or two on their property, where we could, basically have small nurseries. I think it's a great idea to, try to get a lot of people involved, but, you got a tree here, you got a tree there, you got, and then you're trying to collect all these trees when you need 300 trees. I'm just thinking that that's going to be quite an endeavor to try to do that. And what we need, at least for our projects, are, hundreds of trees at any one time. And again, I wondered to, again, try to recruit some people who would be willing to set aside an acre or two on their property for this effort.
Well, Charlie, we did that. Actually, is how we started this whole thing. Was the whole idea. Well, we said let's have a nursery. That was really the whole thing that precipitated it. But when you started to get into the details, we found it ends up being an operation. It has to be run by somebody. You have to have, you have to have the ability to protect the trees. You have to be able to water them. You have to be able to cultivate them. So it takes people and resources. And so one thing led to another. Someone suggested this, so we thought we would try it, in that it ends up with no one person owning a place. And I'm not sure where we're going to end up. We don't know if this is going to work. And I think the work that Mike described is going to be something that we'll learn. We'll learn a lot from it and determine whether or not we can actually get the quantity of trees that we need. And if we can't, then we'll be looking at something else. But we did look at a nursery. Getting land from somebody, I don't think would be a difficulty. But the nursery idea is an operation somebody has to run. And so that creates a bit of a problem in itself. So rather than have one operation, you have 1,000 individuals contributing a little bit. So that's the whole idea behind crowdsourcing.
Okay.
Yeah, and my vision for that too is that it's not that we are, sending Peter around to collect all these trees, even though we know he'd do it for us if we asked him. It's more that like we send out the call, hey everybody, if anybody's got a tree that is this diameter, we're looking, to have that harvested or to have that prepared for transport, and then hopefully get them to do the root, cutting and get it ready, and then maybe bring it to a location that's more convenient, not all the way out to the project, but maybe we could collect them up someplace centrally located. But yeah, it's yet to be seen whether or not that's going to actually happen. I suspect there'll be a lot of loss, right? Like there'll be people who are going to like start and then be like, you know what, I don't want that tree to leave, but that's not exactly a horrible thing in the world, as long as we can get the trees that we need.
This is Joe. I have a question for Maureen, if possible, and or perhaps Pete, in that the idea of going into a wet area or swampy wetland and borrowing trees that are going to die anyways is a good one. But I wonder, is there any legal obligations in terms of that if it's a protected wetland?
Well,
You'd have to ask that.
I don't think that that's a problem, Joe.
Okay.
If the landowner gives you permission, and I would say especially if it's a farmer, I don't think there's any legalities in harvesting trees.
As long as they're not endangered species or you're doing clear cutting, which we're not. I
Yeah,
don't think that the permit system, the permits are covering that aspect, especially if the owners say you can go and do it. I had one other thing to add. While while my name was mentioned, sorry.
Okay.
We do have, actually, we do have Maureen and her husband, Steve, are our transitioning platform. They actually have a good size area where we're using to grow cuttings and in the interim while we're trying to get the rest of the program up.
Thanks, Pete.
Okay,
So I could understand, I'm concerned about protected wetlands. Certainly if they're under that magic number with 12.3 or 13.2, I see that, but I know we've had problems in the past in a protected wetland, just going in there, never mind harvesting from it. So it's an interesting question. I like the idea because Maureen and Steve are correct about that they're just going to get inundated with water, and die anyways.
okay. Well, I don't want, certainly anybody feel free to leave. That we've gone past our time and appreciate your attendance. We tried recording this. We'll see whether we can post it or at least post the individual presentation so people can see those, and invite you to come to our next meeting. Maybe I'll just share that with you. Well, maybe I won't. Our
In the
next,
file, George.
there you go. There's the next one. Our next one is same time next week. And it's going to talk a little bit about review of projects that we've got going on, ones we've done in the past, a little bit more detail, and some work that we're doing with agricultural BMPs and some future projects that we've got in the queue. So welcome you to come back to that, and appreciate your attendance. But I'll stick around if people have questions.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Feel free to call, certainly, if you have a question. See you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Joe.
Yep, thank you.
I know.
Hey, Joe or George?
Yep.
You know, I'm buying some trees from the Soil Water Conservation District. They run this thing on an annual basis.
Yep.
Where you can buy, I bought 10 tree, I forget what, I think they were balsam fir for $20 or something like that, you know, and they're small seedlings. I wonder, where do they get all their trees from? I mean, they're selling thousands of trees in the area.
I can answer that. Many of the trees come from Meadowview Farms, which is a tree nursery. I think they're down in Victor now. They used to be out in Byron, and others, depending on, what they're looking for. But I think there's maybe 4 or 5 vendors that they use at Monroe County anyways.
Okay. And I think a lot of the soil conservation districts do this program, I think.
Yes.
Every springtime.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just wondering if there's any way to tap into that. Because again, they're selling lots of trees and quite a few varieties and a lot of natives. Yeah, no, it's just a thought.
Yep. Yeah, it ends up being a quantity question in some cases and a pricing. The more you buy, obviously you get better prices from those same suppliers. Still, they don't give them away. You can spend anywhere from 70 cents to $2 for one live steak. Same kind of pricing for a bare root seedling. So if you need, 5,000 live steaks, that ends up being a fair amount of money. Plus being able to get them. So that's another question. And all those other issues that Mike talked about, I think, are pertinent too, to try to get people engaged. As we think this project through, it is a good way to get people to understand more about what's going on in the basin. So. Well, good. Well, thank you, everybody, again. And we'll see you next week, I hope.
Take care.
Yep.
All right.
Good.
Thanks, George. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
See you, Maureen, Steve.